to make an example of us. So let us be an example, but of our own choosing. The war on meaning is not yet over in the rest of the world. Let us be an example, not a warning. Let us communicate with the world again, not to send distress signals, nor to cry over ruins or spilled milk, but to draw lessons, summarize experiences, and deepen observations. May it help those struggling in the post-truth era. For me, I gained nothing from a decade of rage except for some simple lessons. Most importantly, that every step of debate and struggle in society is a chance to understand, a chance to network, a chance to dream, a chance to plan. Even if things appear simple and indisputable, and we aligned early on with one side of a struggle or abstained early from it altogether, seizing such opportunities to pursue and produce meaning remains a necessity. Without it, we will never get past defeat. He also writes, they will not eject you from history as long as you can still speak. They will not banish you to the past as long as you can still listen. But which present do you inhabit? Haunt the dreams of your comrades and the nightmares of your enemies. Live in a future that never came. Be a specter, a memory, and a herald. Remind them that the current state was not inevitable until it came to be. Do not occupy yourself with the question of why this very possible future failed. Leave the victorious to grope for answers. Be the question and do not heed your impotence. A ghost has no need for material presence or action. You just need to shimmer. And he also writes, if we are to be treated like animals with no agency, so be it. But we shall bypass cattle and livestock, ignore pests, ignore pets and domesticates. We shall look to the lizards, starfish, and earthworms, those beings that can regenerate after any injury, no matter how grave. We shall accept that regenerated organs may not be identical to what was lost. They can appear to be mutilated, but look closer and you will see the beauty in monstrosity, for only the monstrous can hold both the history of dreams and hopes and the reality of defeat and pain together. The monstrous need not forget their old injuries in order to lose their fear of acquiring new ones. Thank you for being here, friends, in person and on Zoom.
As we're gathered here, Alaa Abd sits in a dark cell in a maximum security prison in Cairo. For nearly 3 years now, Alaa has been denied sunlight, he's been denied fresh air or time outside of his cell, he's been denied any kind of reading material or radio, he's been denied a pen and paper, and he's currently on the 40th day of an open-ended hunger strike. Alaa has been prosecuted or imprisoned by every Egyptian regime to rule in his lifetime. And he's been held behind bars, but all for a few months since 2013. So we're not just here to celebrate Alaa's words, the power of his ideas, and his ability to find meaning in difficult times. We're also here to call for his freedom. For those of you unfamiliar with Alaa, you heard a little bit, but he's a writer and a technologist and a political activist. And in the early 2000s, he emerged as a computer programmer and blogger, and he worked on technology localization. And that means he was working on the Arabization of terminology and translating user interfaces into Arabic. And he also, along with his wife Manel, established one of the first blog aggregators in Arabic. And that became a nexus of early online political activism in Egypt. His first imprisonment came in 2006 as he joined protests calling for the independence of the judiciary. When the revolution erupted in Egypt in January of 2011, Alaa was living in South Africa. He moved back home to take part in the uprising. He was incredibly effective and an incredibly engaged political activist, and he really was among our most eloquent of revolutionaries and political thinkers, always looking to the margins and to the marginalized for inspiration. And for this, he's paid a heavy price. He spent 8 of the last 9 years behind bars, and he's become arguably Egypt's most prominent political prisoner. In December, he was handed a new 5-year sentence on false news charges, a sentence that cannot be appealed. Also recently, he gained British citizenship through his mother, who was born in London. So we're gathered here at a moment of both acute crisis and opportunity. And this book, You Have Not Yet Been Defeated, is a collection of Alaa's essays, his speeches, his interviews, his social media posts over the past 10 years. And much of what is in the book was written from prison. We're lucky to have with us Sanaa. She's just 28 years old and she's been in prison 3 times already by the Sisi regime for a total of 3 years and 3 months. The latest, a 1.5-year sentence, and she was just released in December. And she's here in the US touring to promote her brother's book and call for his freedom. So I wanted to start with you, Sanaa, we heard a little bit about Alaa's conditions. Can you describe them in more detail, the effect they've had on him, and why he's decided to go on hunger strike?
Like you said, he's been deprived of everything really, reading materials, sunlight. Alaa is not even allowed a clock, like he's not allowed to be aware of the time of the day. And I think specifically the reading materials thing really got to him. He, back in October, Alaa expressed suicidal thoughts in court. He said, I feel like my brain is stopping, my brain needs input, I can't keep living like a brute, my brain can't run on empty. And he was in this very, and it was surprising for us because Alaa has been through a lot, but would never reach this point. But for some reason, probably my release and also the British citizenship, Alaa found it in him to be resilient again. And so he started a strike on the 2nd of April, and for that I'm happy and I'm proud of him. So the last visit, the last letter we got from him, so although he looks weaker, but he's in a much better place and he's happy about the fact that we're fighting back and about the fact that we're being resilient about it. And I hope now with the British citizenship, unfortunately, it kind of is a game changer because we have a window of opportunity here that maybe we could create enough pressure for his release.
How do states resort to imprisoning people in order to stifle revolutionary thought? And on the other hand, how does the experience of prison generate revolutionary thought?
Well, first of all, let me say how honored I am to have been included in this effort to encourage others to read Alaa Abd el-Fattah's book, to become aware of his situation, and to become involved in the global campaign to free him. And I say this as a person who was once behind bars and whose life was literally saved by people coming together, literally all over the world. And I can't emphasize enough how much we need to demonstrate to Alaa that we have not yet been defeated. I have some notes. You may have seen me looking down at my devices and I can't get online, so this is going to be improvised. But in answer to your question, I would say that I would answer it in several ways. Political prisoners have always, all over the world, helped to elevate the consciousness of people in prison. And as a matter of fact, all of you are now aware of the abolitionist movement, right? The movement to abolish prisons, to abolish police. What you may not know is that movement comes directly from people inside. And And from the interchange between political prisoners, and that definition has been variously proposed as people who are imprisoned precisely because of their political beliefs and activities, but on the other hand, there are people who are in prison and who become conscious and therefore end up spending long decades behind bars. I can say that my co-defendant, Ruchel McGee, has been in prison for 58 years. And we just celebrated his birthday 2 months ago. He turned 83. He's a political prisoner. Leonard Peltier, who, as you know, is one of the key figures in the indigenous, the historical and present indigenous movement. He is one of the longest held political prisoners in the country. Mumia Abu Jamal, we could go on and on. I guess what I'm suggesting is that we think about the connections between political prisoners in this country and political prisoners globally, and specifically political prisoners in Egypt and political prisoners in Palestine. What was the specific question?
Well, it was how do states resort to imprisoning people to stifle revolutionary thought, and how, on the other hand, it can generate revolutionary thought?
Well, yeah, imprisonment has always been a way of attempting to stifle dissent and attempting to stifle a revolutionary activity. And I can just say very briefly, for people who know a little bit about the history of the U.S., the whole history of the prison system is very much connected to the effort to manage the bodies of people who had been enslaved. So that there is that connection between imprisonment and slavery. Imprisonment and the civil rights movement. We all know Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail. And this is the case all over the world. And I just want to use this opportunity to emphasize why we in the U.S. Need to understand the history of Alaa's imprisonment, his involvement in the Arab Spring. And I mention that because without Tahrir Square, we would not have had the movements in this country, Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, we're in today. So, and obviously the state does not want to see that happen. And the prison is, as Al-Juzayr put it, a repressive apparatus of the state, but it's also an ideological apparatus of the state. And yeah, it's the easiest way to try to stifle the development of revolutionary movements. I can think about Fidel Castro and for many years the Cuban revolutionaries spent behind bars. I can think about Nelson Mandela and the effort to stifle the struggle to end apartheid. And I mention this because Alaa is very much aware of the fact that Egypt is in Africa. And oftentimes Egypt is not represented as a part of the African continent. And he's very much inspired by the struggle against apartheid, as you'll see when you read the book.
Well, in Egypt since 2013, we've had a ballooning prison population, and there's been something like 2 or 3 dozen new prisons have been built. President Sisi in September announced that 7 or 8, quote, American-style prisons were being established, and one of them, there was almost like an advertisement video where it shows how it's very clean and the prisoners are working and getting lectures and so forth. Similarly, in this country, the number of prisons in California dramatically increased in the 80s and 90s under Reagan. Can you reflect on the growth of the prison industrial complex and compare it to those trends we're seeing in Egypt today?
Well, to try to be succinct, I would say that there's very definitely a connection between the growth in the construction of prisons in Egypt now and the period of the 1980s, the Reagan-Bush era, which was also the period of the rise of global capitalism. And one of the things that I so appreciate about Alaa's book is that he never loses sight of the global forces, the global developments. And that he is, I was just talking to his sister, Sanaa, he always points to the pitfalls of nationalism and argues that we have to be aware of the impact of these global forces. So I say that because the 1980s was the period of the rise of global capitalism. It was a period during which we saw the ideology of neoliberalism beginning to take hold. It was a period in which deindustrialization happened. So many companies, corporations left the US to go to the global south in search of cheaper labor forces, and therefore huge numbers of people lost their jobs, and especially people of color, especially Black people, especially Latinx people. And at the same time, as these jobs disappeared, the auto industry, the steel industry, et cetera, the ways in which people had survived, the social welfare programs, access to health care began to decline. And so therefore people were left with literally nothing. And this was the context in which they began the building of huge numbers of prisons. From the 80s to the present, something like 22 prisons were built in the state of California. And the prisons then became the receptacle for those whose problems, unemployment, lack of health care, lack of education, and so forth, the state did not want to acknowledge. And I think we may be witnessing something very similar, that this is the capitalist response at a time when wealth is increasingly concentrated in the hands of a few people. I mean, look at Elon Musk, look at Jeff Bezos. And at the same time, we see huge rates of unemployment and people getting evicted from their homes. So the prison is the capitalist response. And I think we see this, we see the very similar dynamics, both in the US and in Egypt, as well as in other countries around the world.
Well, on prison abolition, can you talk a little bit about the history of this idea, of this movement in the United States, and how it can be transposed globally into other contexts?
Well, I'll try to give you the short history. Because there have been critiques of the institution of the prison and calls to end imprisonment as long as the prison itself has been used as the primary mode of punishment. And not only in the US. As a matter of fact, the abolitionist movement that began to take root in the 1970s was the Attica uprising. As a matter of fact, I was in jail myself when I first became familiar with the term prison abolition, and it was because of the fact that in 1971, when the Attica brothers rose up, they called for an end to imprisonment. And then you have groups like the American Friends Service Committee that began to do organizing around prison abolition and produced in the mid-70s an abolitionist handbook called Instead of Prisons. At the same time, you had people in other countries, in Europe, for example, in the Netherlands and the Scandinavian countries, beginning to develop what you might call a philosophical theory of abolition, which we don't have time to go into. Most recently, in 1998, a group of people in the San Francisco Bay Area got together and decided to organize a gathering that was called Critical Resistance Beyond the Prison Industrial Complex. And since that period, activists, intellectuals, advocates, such as legal workers and lawyers, have been striving to introduce this into the mainstream discourse. And of course, we know that as a consequence of the lynching, the police lynching of George Floyd and the murder of Breonna Taylor and all of the events that took place during the pandemic, the raising of the slogan, defund the police, abolition has entered now into public discourse, and people are seriously talking about abolishing police and prisons. And I have to tell you that, yeah, thank you for but I have to tell you that I never ever imagined that I would witness this moment. I mean, I assumed that that eventually people would begin to be involved in a public conversation about police and prison abolition, but I did not think that I would still be here to witness it. And none of us did. We thought we were imagining a different future. And I connected so much with this book because of your brother's emphasis on the imagination, that we cannot allow the imagination to be imprisoned.
Well, also on abolition, I wanted to tie it back to what Alaa writes a lot about, kind of rejecting these temptations of easy nationalism, where it's very easy to rally people around the cause of nationalism, and so it's very seductive. But he also writes about the trap of masculinity in struggle. And he's basically writing about how movements should be internationalist, not nationalist, and feminist, not masculine. And you've written about the importance of abolitionist strategies being also feminist strategies. Can you explain what you mean by that?
There is this book that I collaborated with 3 other people to write that's called Abolition Feminism Now. And in the course of writing the book, we were thinking back on the work that was done around critical resistance. And what's so interesting is that although all of us have been involved in critical resistance, and I was on the first organizing committee, I had sort of forgotten that it was almost all women. I mean, it's not surprising, is it? But I gender non-conforming people. But that's just an observation. And I so, again, appreciated Alaa's emphasis on a feminist approach and his making the point that, as we all know, violence against women, and that of course includes trans women, is the most pandemic form of violence in the world. Yeah. It's everywhere. Yeah. And so if ever we are going to imagine ridding the world of violence, we have to figure out how to get rid of gender violence. But then of course there are those, the kind of traditional feminists, the feminists who are anti-racist and anti-capitalist, who assume that you just use the existing repressive apparatuses, and therefore you use the police and you use the prisons. And so if we accept that, it means that in the course of attempting to get rid of gender violence, you're strengthening the sources of structural racism. You're strengthening the police, you're strengthening the prison. So this is exactly why abolition always has to have a feminist dimension. Both be aware of what is required right now, and we can make demands right now for Biden to withdraw aid to Egypt. It's over $1 billion in aid every year. To Israel, it's over $8 billion a year. So we can do that. And there's so many other things that we can do. But we also have to be aware of the long-term impact of the work that we do now. As Sanaa was pointing out, oftentimes occasions arise for us to move in revolutionary directions without our having predicted them, or most of the time. We cannot predict when we could not have predicted that the pandemic combined with an awareness of structural racism would give rise to the conditions that happened in this country in the summer of 2020. The other point I want to make is that those moments come and then they go. And oftentimes we are under the impression that that's a part of the past. We're no longer in a moment now that has revolutionary promise. So I want to suggest that we think of these moments as moments of promise. The Arab Spring was a moment of great promise, and though it is no longer with us at this moment, we have to remember the promise. Because unfulfilled promises of the past can become agendas for the future. I want to say that especially now, with the rise of the right wing and the effort to turn back the clock everywhere, including especially in this country, we saw what happened with the Supreme Court. We have to redouble our efforts. We cannot stop the organizing. And so, I want to, and all of these agendas require collective organizing. We cannot do it as individuals. We have to do it as a community. And I made a note not to forget to point out that a lot of always emphasizes the connection with the environmental crisis. This is something we all share. And I was so impressed by this book. So one of my final appeals would be for every one of you to get this book and read it. Because you learn a great deal about it. And it's a beautiful book, and it's about it's about the connection between the imagination and happiness. The sections I love so much about this book were about his relationship with his son Khaled, and I think that if we can make that possibility of happiness and love collective and global, we can persuade ourselves that we need to do everything we can at this moment to move the world forward. And just one final thing that I almost forgot. Abolition is not just about tearing down. Abolition is not just about getting rid of. It's not just about getting rid of prisons and police. It's about creating the kinds of solutions that will really allow us to live in a world where there is safety, where there is security. So it is about housing and healthcare and all of the things human beings need in order to live together in love, happiness, and security.